There are places on earth where time doesn't move, it lingers. Byblos is one of them. Perched on the coast of Lebanon, this ancient city has watched the world grow old and young again more times than we can count. Long before empires were drawn on maps, long before kings signed decrees or poets carved their names in stone, the people of this coast were already whispering to the sea. And the sea, it seems, whispered back. The waves that break against Byblos have carried more than salt and foam. They've carried memory, the kind that doesn't belong to one civilization but to the human spirit itself. When the wind blows through the ruins, it sounds almost like speech, a language too old for letters, too soft for translation. And yet, it was here, in this quiet corner of the Mediterranean, that the idea of writing, of giving shape to sound, of letting thought survive time, was born. Byblos was not built for conquest. It had no walls of gold, no dreams of empire. It was born for something quieter, connection, between sea and desert, between gods and men, between what could be seen and what had to be remembered. Traders, sailors, priests, and wanderers met here, exchanged goods and stories, and left behind something greater than all of them, a way for words to live without a voice. Every alphabet you've ever read, every poem, every prayer, every message whispered across centuries, began with that spark, the moment when a mark on clay meant a sound, and a sound meant an idea. It is a simple thing, almost too simple to notice, and yet it changed everything. Without it, there would be no history, no memory, no us. When you walk through Byblos today, the stones seem to listen. The sea hums softly below the harbor, where wooden ships once carried the first written names of gods and kings. You can almost feel it, the pulse of something eternal, the hush before the birth of words. So tonight, as we drift through time together, let us return to the shore where humanity first found its voice, where the alphabet was born, and where silence learned to speak. If you stand on the cliffs above Byblos at dawn, you can see both the desert and the sea breathing at once. The horizon is never still. The gold of the east meets the silver of the west, and between them lies the fragile line of a city that has learned to exist in two worlds. For thousands of years, Byblos has stood here, not as a monument but as a bridge, a crossing point between lands, faiths, and times. Long before it was called Byblos, it had another name, Gebal, the mountain by the sea. It was a settlement of fishermen, traders, and craftsmen who lived by the rhythm of the waves and the wind. To the north stretched the endless waters of the Mediterranean, a mirror of unknown worlds. To the south and east rose the mountains of Lebanon, veiled in cedar forests, whose scent filled the air like incense. Between the two, water and wood, sea and stone, life began to take on meaning. This balance shaped everything. The people of Byblos looked to the sea not as an enemy, but as a partner, a living presence that brought both danger and fortune. From the mountains they drew timber and the famous cedar of Lebanon, tall, fragrant, and unyielding, destined to become ships, temples, and palaces in distant lands. The city's harbor became a doorway through which both material and myth passed freely. Egyptian sailors brought gold and papyrus, Mesopotamian merchants brought tin and lapis lazuli, and in exchange Byblos offered its greatest gift, connection. To live in Byblos was to live between two breaths, the warm air of the desert and the cool wind of the sea. Its people learned early that survival came not from domination, but from understanding. They did not wage wars to carve out borders. They opened harbors to invite the world in. It was here, among the smell of salt and cedar, that a new idea of civilization began to form, one built not on power, but on exchange. Perhaps that is why memory clings so strongly to this place. Every stone bears the imprint of a meeting, of languages blending, of goods changing hands, of gods being renamed and reimagined. Here, cultures did not collide, they conversed, and in that conversation, something timeless was born. Even now, when the wind blows from the east, it carries the same scent, the same breath of cedar and sea that filled the lungs of the first sailors. They must have looked out at the horizon and wondered, as we do tonight, where does one world end and the next begin? Byblos never answered that question. It simply lived in the space between. There are trees that belong to a place, and there are trees that belong to time itself. The cedar of Lebanon is one of those. It rises straight and still, its scent sweet but solemn, a kind of living monument. For the people of Byblos, the cedar was more than wood. It was a bridge between earth and heaven. They believed its roots reached the bones of the mountains, while its crown touched the breath of the gods. Long before the pyramids reached for the sky, cedar trunks from Lebanon were being dragged down from the hills, floated along rivers, and loaded onto ships bound for Egypt. The Egyptians prized this wood above all else. For their temples, their sarcophagi, even the sacred boats buried beside their kings. And again, those ships came to one port, Byblos. From that trade, an unspoken bond grew between the two civilizations. On one shore, the builders of stone; on the other, the masters of timber and tide. Byblos became the gate through which Egypt spoke to the north. It was said that the pharaoh himself would send envoys to the city, bearing gold and linen, to ask for the cedar of the gods. Some letters from that time still exist, written in cuneiform, carved on clay, and in their faded lines one can still feel respect, urgency, even affection. The tone is not of conquest, but of need. Every log that left the forest carried more than the scent of resin. It carried a fragment of Byblos's soul. The people learned that trade was not only about goods, it was about memory. Every shipment tied one world to another. The cedar ships that carried wood south to Egypt often returned with papyrus, incense, and myths. Slowly, silently, the stories of gods and men began to mingle. Isis and Balat Gabal, the goddess of Byblos, were sometimes spoken of as sisters. Perhaps they were. It is no wonder that ships became sacred here. To the people of Byblos, a ship was a living creature, a cedar spine upon which dreams and destinies were carried. When a vessel left the harbor, families stood by the shore and whispered blessings to the wind, asking the sea to remember their names. The cedar gave them a body, the sea gave them a soul. Together they built not an empire of land, but of movement, a civilization that floated. And somewhere in that constant crossing between forest and horizon, between mountain air and salt spray, the idea of permanence began to change. Perhaps, they thought, what truly lasts is not what stands still, but what moves and returns again. Before there were alphabets, there were gestures. Before words, there were symbols, small marks scratched into clay, simple enough to seem meaningless, yet powerful enough to carry a thought across generations. In Byblos, these first signs began to appear on pots, stones, and amulets, long before anyone imagined what writing could become. The people of this coast lived surrounded by messages they could not yet read, the spiral of a shell, the curve of a wave, the line of a mountain fading into haze. Nature was the first script, and humanity was still learning how to listen. When they carved a shape onto stone, they weren't recording a fact, they were keeping a feeling. A mark meant rain, or fertility, or protection, a whisper to the unseen world. In time, these marks began to speak to one another. A circle beside a line might mean a god, a wave beneath it might mean his realm. Slowly, thought began to take form outside the mind, and in that moment something miraculous happened. Memory detached itself from the body. What was once told by voice could now outlive the speaker. In Byblos, this change was not sudden. It unfolded like the tide, returning each day a little further. Traders carried clay tablets from Mesopotamia. Egyptian envoys brought painted symbols of their own. The people of Byblos saw these systems, complex, beautiful, divine, and wondered if they could create one of their own, not for priests or kings, but for everyone who could hear a sound. There was an understanding growing here. That thought did not belong only to temples, and that words could travel as freely as ships. When a merchant marked a crate with a simple symbol for fish or wine, he was not only organizing trade, he was organizing language. The written world was being born in the marketplace, not the palace. And yet these early symbols were still more art than text, curves that echoed the waves, strokes that followed the grain of cedar. They belonged as much to the eye as to the mind. Some archaeologists today call them proto-writing, but perhaps that is too small a name. For the people who carved them, these were not experiments, they were prayers, an attempt to hold the invisible still, to keep a piece of life from vanishing into silence. From these first lines would one day emerge letters, simple, pure, endlessly repeatable. But that future was still distant, for now, Byblos was dreaming of language the way a sculptor dreams of a form hidden inside stone. The sea has always known how to carry messages, even before humans learned to write them, and one day, across the water from the south, a new kind of visitor began to arrive. They came from the kingdom of the Nile, wearing linen white as sunlight and bearing the smell of foreign incense. They called this place Capon, the port of the cedar, and to them it was sacred, the source of the wood that touched the heavens. Egypt had pyramids, but no forests. Byblos had forests, but no stone. Between them, a bond was inevitable. For thousands of years, ships sailed between these two worlds, their sails filled with wind and destiny. In clay, archives unearthed at Tel El Amarna letters survive, royal correspondences between the pharaohs and the kings of Byblos, written more than 3,000 years ago. The tone is formal, but beneath it runs something human: frustration, dependence, affection. One letter from the ruler of Byblos pleads for aid, describing enemies at his gates and the urgent need for gold and soldiers. Another from a pharaoh scolds him for sending fewer logs than promised. Yet even in reprimand there is recognition that this small coastal city held something Egypt could not live without. Every beam of cedar that reached the Nile became part of Egypt's eternity. The great temples of Karnak and the sacred boats of Ra all carried the scent of Lebanon's mountains. But beyond trade, there was awe. Egyptian priests believed that the goddess Isis herself had wandered to Byblos in search of her lost husband Osiris. In the myth, she found his body hidden inside a cedar trunk, the wood of this land, which had been made into a pillar in a foreign palace. When she wept beside the sea, the waves answered, and so Byblos became, even to Egypt, a place of mourning and rebirth. It is said that Egyptian envoys, upon landing here, offered perfumes to the local goddess Balat Gabal, lady of the city, to win her favor. The cults of two nations intertwined like roots beneath the sea. To the Egyptians, Byblos was a holy port. To Byblos, Egypt was a mirror of what civilization could become. In that meeting, something changed. Byblos saw how power could be written, how history could be preserved not by memory alone, but by marks on stone. The letters carried between the two cities were more than requests, they were revelations. They showed that writing could bind nations, that ink could build what armies could not. And when those ships sailed back south, loaded with timber and tablets, the people of Byblos must have stood at the shore, watching their words disappear into the horizon, wondering if someday they would return as stories. Every ancient city has a heart, and in Byblos that heart was a temple. At its center stood the goddess Balat Gabal, the lady of Byblos, guardian of the port, mother of merchants, and voice of the divine sea. Her temple rose on a hill overlooking the harbor so that even the ships departing could see her columns shining in the sun. The scent of cedar and incense mingled in the air, and the smoke that curled above her altar was said to guide sailors safely home. The people of Byblos did not separate the sacred from the daily. To them, every act of life was part of the same offering. The fishermen who cast their nets at dawn would whisper a prayer to Baalat. The carpenters who shaped cedar beams would carve her sign into the wood. Even the traders weighing copper on their scales would touch the metal to their lips, asking the goddess to keep deceit away. She was the breath between each exchange, unseen but always felt, and beside her temple lived those who spoke her words, the priestesses of Gebal. They were not rulers, but their presence carried a kind of quiet authority. It was said that when the Egyptian envoys arrived, it was these women who received them first, interpreting their offerings and translating their rituals. In the great myth of Isis and Osiris, when the Egyptian goddess came to Byblos, it was the queen herself, a reflection of Baalat, who welcomed her, washing her with the water of the sacred spring and dressing her in cedar oil. The rituals of Byblos were old even then. Offerings of oil, bronze, and wine were laid upon stone tables. Music echoed through the courtyards, lyres, drums, and the soft rhythm of hands clapping to the beat of the waves. The temple was more than a place of worship. It was a conversation with the elements. Every prayer was a contract, every gesture a line in the great unwritten text of devotion. Over centuries, foreign gods would come and go, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, but Baalat Gebal never left. Her name changed, her face took new forms, yet the essence remained, a woman standing between sea and sky, holding memory in her hands. Some called her Astarte, others Aphrodite, but the people of Byblos knew she was always the same light returning through different names. Today, the stones of her temple still stand. The steps are worn smooth by generations of feet, the altars chipped by time. But if you visit at dusk, when the sea turns to silver and the wind moves through the ruins, you might still feel her watching. The priestess of Gebal has not gone, she has merely become part of the air. For in Byblos, faith was never about seeing, it was about remembering. No empire ever changed the world as deeply as an idea, and in Byblos one such idea was born. It did not come from a throne or a god or a general. It began in the hands of merchants, sailors, and scribes, ordinary people who needed a way to remember, to record, to speak beyond their breath. The old ways of writing were beautiful, but heavy. The Egyptians painted whole thoughts with pictures. The Mesopotamians pressed complex wedges into clay. Both systems required years of study and a priestly class to preserve them, but the people of Byblos lived differently. They moved, they traded, they needed something light enough to carry across the sea, something that belonged to everyone, not just to the temple. And so, somewhere between the marketplace and the shrine, the alphabet began to take shape. It was a revolution made not of swords, but of symbols, 20-something marks, each standing for a single sound. No pictures of gods or beasts, no sacred hieroglyphs, only the music of the human voice set into form. For the first time, writing did not describe the world, it became it. Each letter was like a drop of water, small, simple, but capable of carrying the ocean. Combine them, and the sea spoke. A trader could mark his goods, a sailor could note the names of ports, a father could carve his son's name into stone and know it would endure. The alphabet was the first true democracy of memory. The oldest examples found near Byblos, scratched onto fragments of pottery and stone, show the moment language broke free of its chains. You can still trace the lines, a curve, a cross, a tiny symbol that once meant Be, Beth, house, home. It was a fitting beginning, for every alphabet is, in its own way, a home for thought. The genius of this system lay in its simplicity. 22 letters could capture every sound the tongue could make. It needed no interpreter, no divine key. Anyone could learn it, anyone could use it. In that sense, the birth of the alphabet was not merely a technical event, it was a philosophical awakening. For the first time, human beings realized that meaning could be built piece by piece by their own hands. From these marks carved in Byblos, the Phoenician alphabet would soon set sail to Cyprus, to Crete, to Greece, changing not just how people wrote, but how they thought. The temple still stood above the harbor, and the goddess still looked out over the sea, but below her, something new was stirring. A faith not in stone or sky, but in the power of a line drawn by a human hand. The age of gods had not ended. It had simply begun to learn how to speak. Words, once born, have a strange desire. They want to move. They want to cross borders, to drift beyond the hands that made them. In Byblos, the alphabet was never meant to stay still. It was born beside the sea, and like every child of the sea, it longed to travel. At first, it sailed quietly, written on clay tablets, carved into wood, painted on crates of cedar and jars of wine. Traders carried it from port to port, marking their cargo so that distant harbors could read their intentions without a single spoken word, a symbol for fish, a line for oil, a letter for home. Each mark was a promise between strangers. The alphabet spread not through conquest, but through contact. Every trade route was a river of language. When a ship left Byblos for Cyprus, its letters went with it. When it reached Crete or Ugarit, others copied them, reshaped them, adapted them to their own speech. Soon, the same set of simple sounds could be heard echoing across thousands of miles, a quiet revolution carried by salt and wind. Unlike empires, words did not demand allegiance. They invited participation. Each culture that received the alphabet made it its own, adding curves, accents, breaths. The Phoenician sailors did not guard their creation as a secret. They shared it as naturally as they shared the sea. For them, writing was not property. It was proof that understanding was possible. The world that opened through these letters was vast. Imagine a dock in the Bronze Age, the clatter of cargo, the shouts of men, the creak of ropes. Amid the noise, a scribe bends over a plank, scratching a short line of text, perhaps an invoice, perhaps a name. He looks up, squints toward the horizon, and wonders if anyone hundreds of leagues away will one day read it. He cannot know that the marks beneath his hand will evolve into Greek, Latin, Arabic, into the alphabets of half the world. Byblos did not spread its power through armies, but through literacy. It taught the world a new way to exist, not by remembering through ritual, but by recording through reason. The alphabet turned sound into shape, and shape into continuity. It was, in its own way, immortality. And so the harbor of Byblos became something more than a port. It became a pulse. Every departing ship was a heartbeat, every returning sail a memory renewed. The waves that carried cedar and copper also carried meaning, unbound by time. Somewhere in the endless rhythm of those tides, humanity learned its most enduring lesson. That knowledge, like the sea, was never meant to belong to one shore. If the earth has a library, its pages are made of water. Every wave is a line rewritten, every current a sentence rearranged. And in the long story of civilization, the sea has been both messenger and witness, carrying the words of humanity and burying its ruins beneath the tide. The people of Byblos understood this long before any philosopher tried to name it. To them, the sea was alive, not a void, but a memory. When a ship left the harbor, it was not disappearing. It was joining a vast conversation that stretched beyond sight. The wind carried not just sails, but messages. The waves did not erase, they recorded. For thousands of years, these waters have kept secrets. Somewhere beneath them lies the wood of Phoenician ships, their hulls carved with the first alphabets. Bronze anchors, amphorae, tablets of clay, fragments of sentences that once connected cities. Divers still find them, resting in the quiet blue, words turned to coral, history softened by salt. They are reminders that nothing truly vanishes, it only changes form. Even the myths remember. In the old stories, the gods who died in the West were carried eastward by the sea to be reborn, an image that feels almost like truth. For every civilization that has fallen into silence, another has risen, guided by echoes. The same waves that lapped at the shores of Byblos would later touch the coasts of Greece, Rome, Carthage, whispering the same rhythm to new ears. Perhaps that is why so many temples in Byblos face the horizon. The priests and sailors both believed the sea could listen. When they poured oil into the waves, it wasn't an offering of fear, but of remembrance, and they knew that everything said to the sea would be kept, not perfectly, not word for word, but in essence. Today, when you stand on the same shore, the sound has not changed. The sea still speaks in the same ancient tongue, low, endless, patient. It tells of ships that never returned, of names carved into lost wood, of alphabets scattered like shells across the Mediterranean floor. It tells of humanity's longing to be remembered. And maybe, somewhere deep below, the words of Byblos are still there, waiting, intact, pressed into sand like a letter that was never meant to be opened. For memory does not need to survive in stone or script. Sometimes it only needs to float. They began as merchants, practical, restless, always in motion, but over time, the traders of Byblos became something else entirely. Carriers of knowledge, unwitting teachers of the world. They did not found universities or write philosophies. They built ships, mapped winds, and taught others how to name the things they saw. Their classroom was the sea, their chalkboard, the horizon. Every voyage was a lesson. When they sailed east to Mesopotamia, they brought the secrets of navigation and the alphabet. When they went west to the islands of Greece, they traded not only goods, but symbols, the same letters that would become alpha and beta. Their roots tied together cultures that might never have met otherwise, weaving a net of exchange stronger than any empire's borders. To the Phoenicians, teaching was not a mission. It was simply what happened when people met and shared what they knew. They did not guard their discoveries as treasures, they offered them like gifts. The alphabet spread because it was useful, yes, but also because it was generous. It did not demand a temple or a priesthood. It asked only for a voice. Byblos was at the heart of this transformation. In its harbor, one could hear half the languages of the ancient world: Egyptian, Akkadian, Aramaic, Greek, all mingling in the air. The city was not a museum of cultures, but a living marketplace of ideas. And in the rhythm of buying and selling and the act of exchange itself, people learned a deeper lesson, that knowledge grows not by keeping, but by giving. A scribe in Byblos once wrote, "Words are like fire. Once you share them, they belong to all." That is perhaps the oldest definition of civilization. The Phoenicians did not conquer by sword or creed. They conquered by connection. Their ships carried timber and tin, wine and glass, but also stories, songs, names. They taught distant peoples how to read the winds, how to mark the moon for navigation, how to carve letters into clay. And when those foreign students learned, they changed the alphabet, reshaping it for their own tongues, proof that every culture adds its own breath to the same eternal voice. By the time the Greek world rose, the Phoenician letters had already become the foundation of literacy across the Mediterranean, and from Greece, Rome would inherit them, and through Rome, the world. It is humbling to think that the handwriting of every modern language, every printed page, every whispered word of poetry carries a trace of Byblos. The traders who once stood on that harbor counting their goods could never have known that they were also counting the first lines of humanity's endless book. In giving the world its alphabet, Byblos gave it something even greater, a way to remember itself. Every journey changes the traveler, and every traveler, in turn, changes what they carry. When the Phoenician alphabet reached the shores of Greece, It had already crossed countless waves, languages, and hands. But here, in this land of philosophers and poets yet to come, the letters took on new life. The Greeks adopted the script of the traders from Byblos and gave it voice, a clearer sound, a wider reach, a new rhythm to thought itself. They called it Phoenicia Grammata, the Phoenician writing. It was the first time a foreign alphabet was not just borrowed but reborn. The Greeks added vowels, giving language breath, tone, and music. What had once been a practical tool for commerce became a living instrument for art and philosophy. The marks that had labeled jars of cedar oil and amphorae of wine now shaped the dialogues of Plato, the tragedies of Sophocles, and the epics of Homer. Yet even in that transformation, the spirit of Byblos endured. The Greek alpha came from the Phoenician aleph, meaning ox, symbol of strength. Beta came from Beth, meaning house, symbol of shelter. The words changed, but the ideas remained. It was as if the old meanings carved long ago in Byblos were still whispering beneath the new. The house became the home of reason. The ox became the drive of speech. In their temples and theaters, the Greeks spoke of beauty, logic, and form, but behind every syllable lingered the simplicity of those first Phoenician signs, that a mark could hold a sound, and a sound could hold the universe. What began as trade became tradition. The alphabet did what no empire ever could. It united people not through fear or conquest, but through understanding, and the Greeks, in their brilliance, carried that gift forward, unaware that they were only continuing a story that had started centuries earlier on the Lebanese coast, where sailors once scratched names into planks of cedar. Perhaps that is the true genius of humanity, not to invent from nothing, but to listen, to inherit, and to transform. The Greeks listened to the sea as the Phoenicians once had. They learned its rhythm, its cadence, and they wrote it down. From their pens, the alphabet became philosophy. From their tongues, it became song. From their memory, it became history itself. And though the names of the first Phoenician scribes were forgotten, their legacy lived on in every Greek word spoken to the sky, every inscription carved in marble, every idea that would one day cross the Aegean and reshape the mind of the West. The sea had done what it always does. It carried the essence of one world into another without losing its soul. The Greeks gave the alphabet a soul. Rome gave it an empire. When the letters that had once been carved into cedar and clay reached the Latin world, they changed again, but their heart remained the same. The Romans, ever practical and disciplined, took the fluid script of the Greeks and shaped it into something sharp, solemn, and enduring. In their hands, language became law. To Rome, the written word was more than expression. It was authority. A decree etched into bronze could command armies. A single inscription could claim a province. The alphabet, born in Byblos and refined in Athens, now carried the weight of empire. Each letter was a monument, each sentence a boundary. Yet beneath the order in stone, the old rhythm of the sea remained. The Romans carved their words with the same reverence the Phoenicians once carved their symbols into driftwood, believing that what was written could outlast death. And in a way, it did. The language of Rome outlived its legions. The empire collapsed, but the alphabet endured, stronger than the walls of the Colosseum, more lasting than marble. It spread with missionaries, merchants, and scholars. It crossed mountains, rivers, and centuries. From scrolls to codices, from cathedrals to classrooms, the Roman script, the descendant of the alphabet of Byblos, became the backbone of the Western world. Even today, when you read a page, you are seeing through Roman eyes. The straight lines, the curves, the balance of form and function, they all reflect that ancient discipline. But the spark that animates them, the idea that a mark can carry meaning across time, belongs to an older world still, the quiet port where a sailor first traced his thoughts into wood. There is something deeply human in this inheritance. The Phoenicians taught us how to write. The Greeks taught us what to say, the Romans taught us how to preserve it, and together they built the scaffolding of memory, a chain of thought stretching from cedar to stone, from sea to empire. In the libraries of Rome, scrolls filled with Latin verse lay beside Greek philosophy and Egyptian lore, a silent meeting of civilizations bound by the same alphabetic thread. The Romans might not have known the name Byblos, but its echo lived in every book they copied, every contract they signed, every prayer they whispered in ink. By the time their empire reached its height, the alphabet had become more than a tool. It was an inheritance, not of territory, but of understanding. The stones of Byblos may have weathered, the cedar forests may have thinned, but the letters, those small, simple marks, continued their quiet march through history, outlasting every crown they ever served. Every civilization builds a place to store its dreams. Some choose temples, some choose archives, but in Byblos, legend says it was a library, a sanctuary of words and clay, of scrolls and stories gathered from across the known world. They called it the House of Letters, though its walls have long since vanished. No stone inscription tells us exactly where it stood. Archaeologists have found tablets, fragments of texts, seals of scribes, but the building itself, if it ever existed, has been swallowed by centuries of silence. And yet, the idea of it endures because it feels inevitable. How could the city that gave birth to writing not also give shelter to what was written? Travelers from Egypt and Greece once spoke of a place in Byblos where merchants, priests, and scholars met to exchange not only goods, but knowledge. Some came to copy contracts, others to read old myths. Papyrus rolls from the Nile were traded for cedar, then stored in cool stone chambers to keep them safe from the sea's breath. They said the air inside smelled of ink and salt, like the edge of a storm. It is possible that within those lost walls, the first attempts at a written history of the world were born, records of voyages, treaties, hymns, names of gods now forgotten, words that tried to measure time itself. The people of Byblos might not have known they were inventing a memory system that would outlive them all, but in a sense they were. Some say that when the great libraries of the ancient world burned in Alexandria and Pergamon and Antioch, the spirit of Byblos lived on. For this city taught the world that memory does not belong to marble shelves or scrolls. It belongs to transmission, to the act of passing knowledge forward. As long as one person remembers, the library remains open. Even today, the ruins of Byblos feel like a reading room without walls. The streets are written in layers: Phoenician, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arabic. Each age has left its own handwriting on the same stone. When you walk there, you are walking through a text, a manuscript of human time, endlessly revised but never erased. Perhaps that is why the city never truly sleeps. Beneath its silence, there is always a murmur, the sound of all that has ever been written here, still echoing through the air. In Byblos, the first library may be gone, but the story continues. The letters it once held are scattered across the world, in alphabets and books, in the minds of those who still believe that knowledge, like fire, should never go out. And so the library of Byblos endures, not in stone, but in us. Every city that has lived long enough learns the language of loss. Byblos knew it early. Empires rose around her like tides, each one certain it would last forever. But the sea, patient and indifferent, taught otherwise. It had seen too many banners flutter and fade. The first great storm came with the Assyrians, soldiers of iron and fire. Their kings demanded tribute from every coast, and the harbors of Byblos were no exception. The cedar that once sailed freely was now measured, taxed, and taken by decree. The city endured by yielding, not resisting. It survived by remembering that waves break, but the shore remains. Then came the Babylonians, then the Persians. Each empire left behind its own scars, a new god, a new law, a new alphabet carved over the old. Yet somehow, The people of Byblos continued to write, to trade, to pray. Even under foreign rule, the city never forgot how to speak. When Alexander's armies arrived from the west, bringing the glitter of Greek armor and the promise of a new age, Byblos opened its gates. The conqueror's men found not a fortress to crush, but a harbor to rest in. Here, they said, the stones themselves seemed to remember peace. And as Hellenistic rule spread, the city adapted once more, learning Greek words, adopting Greek gods, but keeping its Phoenician heart. Centuries later, the Romans came. They built roads and theaters, temples and markets. They called the city Gebal, but still wrote Byblos on their maps, a quiet nod to its unbroken name. The alphabet that had once sailed from this very shore now returned as Latin, etched into marble, commanding authority in the language it had helped to create. And when the Roman Empire itself fell, when the world darkened and faiths shifted, Byblos remained, shrinking, sleeping, but alive. Byzantine crosses replaced Roman eagles. Later, the call to prayer rose from new minarets. The names of rulers changed, but the rhythm of life, the hum of the sea, the creak of wood, the whisper of trade, stayed the same. Perhaps this was the city's secret. It never resisted time. It moved with it quietly, like a stone rolling in the current. Empires sought permanence. Byblos sought continuity. In every invasion, it lost something, like a statue, a temple, a tongue, but it kept what mattered most, the instinct to remember. Beneath every ruin, there was another layer, and beneath that, another still. To dig here is to unearth not one city, but 1,000, each built from the bones of the one before. No conqueror ever truly ruled Byblos. They only borrowed it for a while, because how do you conquer a place that has already learned how to survive the end of the world? Byblos was always a paradox, a city of trade that thought like a philosopher. Its harbor was filled with the noise of haggling, the clatter of amphorae, the scent of fish and resin. Yet behind those sounds lay something quieter, an understanding that every exchange, no matter how small, was also an act of meaning. The people of Byblos did not see commerce and knowledge as opposites. To them, they were two sides of the same coin. One sustained the body, the other, the mind. In the bustling markets by the shore, merchants spoke many tongues: Egyptian, Greek, Aramaic, Latin. To bargain here was to learn. The act of trade demanded translation, patience, and empathy. Every transaction required trust, every voyage, understanding. In that sense, the market was a classroom, and the merchant a student of the world. The scholar, too, was a trader, not in goods, but in ideas. He listened to sailors tell of foreign lands, collected myths from travelers, copied old scrolls, and sold new ones. The boundary between learning and livelihood blurred until it vanished completely. In Byblos, to know something was to share it, and to share it was to survive. Over time, this blending of intellect and industry gave the city a strange resilience. While empires rose and fell through conquest, Byblos endured through conversation. It had no armies, no fortresses of marble. Its strength lay in its ability to connect, to turn difference into dialogue. Some old inscriptions even mention houses of scribes near the harbor, small workshops where men and women copied texts for merchants and priests alike. One might order a prayer to be written in Phoenician, another a trade contract in Greek. To write here was both a sacred act and a service, knowledge and commerce bound in the same ink. The people of Byblos seem to understand something the modern world often forgets, that wisdom is not found in isolation but in exchange. The merchant learned philosophy from the sailor's story. The scholar found truth in the price of salt. Each gave the other what they lacked, and together they made a civilization that could think and breathe at once. And perhaps that is why the alphabet was born here, in a city that refused to divide the mind from the hand. To trade is to communicate, To write is to trade in meaning. Both acts require faith, that what you send out into the world will be received, and that in return, something of value will come back. Byblos never stopped believing in that rhythm, the endless give and take, the dialogue between silence and sound, between knowing and doing. In its markets and manuscripts, its prayers and ports, it lived by a single rule. Everything that moves teaches. Everything that teaches moves. Every ruin is a sentence the earth never finished, and in Byblos those sentences stretch across millennia, carved in sandstone, baked in sun, softened by wind. To walk here is to walk through time itself, layered and living, each step pressing lightly on the dust of 1,000 lives. The city does not have one story, it has many, built one atop another like pages in a book that refuse to close. Beneath the modern streets lie the bones of Bronze Age walls. Beneath those, still older stones shaped by hands that never knew the word Phoenician, yet built the foundation for everything that followed. Archaeologists call it a tell, a mound made by history itself, growing taller with every era. They dig through levels of civilization like readers turning back through chapters, searching for the first line. In Byblos, they find it again and again, the same desire repeated across ages to build, to write, to endure. Here, a temple dedicated to Balat Gabal, the lady of the city. There, a sarcophagus bearing inscriptions to the kings who once ruled this coast. On another slope, the remnants of a Roman colonnade, still upright after 2,000 years, their shadows long and patient in the afternoon light. Between them, fragments of pottery, bits of jewelry, shards of script, the debris of eternity. When the sun sets, these ruins change. The tourists leave, the air cools, and the stones begin to speak again, not in words, but in a slow, rhythmic silence. You can almost hear it, the sound of chisels long gone, the echo of footsteps from centuries past. The city breathes in its sleep. Some of the inscriptions found here are among the oldest ever carved in the Phoenician alphabet. Their letters, still visible despite the wear of time, curve and twist with an elegance that feels almost human. It is strange, standing before them, to realize that the same shapes, the same alphabet, still lives in every language that uses the Roman script today. Every carved line is an ancestor of your handwriting. Byblos is, in that sense, not just a ruin, it is a mirror. It shows us what remains when sound becomes silence, when meaning becomes matter. The stones here are not dead, they are patient. They wait for those who will listen, and perhaps that is the lesson the city has been trying to teach since the beginning, that history is not something that happened, but something that continues to happen quietly beneath our feet. If you listen closely, you might still hear the murmurs, the prayers of sailors, the bargains of merchants, the laughter of children playing among the columns. The city has lost its kings, its armies, its empire, but not its voice, because Byblos was never built merely to be seen. It was built to be remembered. The Phoenicians never built an empire of land. They built an empire of connection. Their strength did not lie in armies, but in curiosity. From Byblos to Tyre, from Sidon to Carthage, they shared one simple belief, that the world was not meant to be divided, but crossed. The Phoenician mind was shaped by the sea. The horizon was never a limit. It was an invitation. Every wave seemed to whisper, "Go farther." They did not see distance as danger, but as possibility. To sail, to trade, to listen, these were acts of faith. They trusted that understanding could bridge any gulf. This was not naive optimism, it was philosophy. They knew the world could be harsh, but they also knew that isolation was death. The sea demanded cooperation. A ship survived only if every hand found its rhythm. A voyage succeeded only if strangers became allies. Over centuries, that truth became a worldview. The Phoenicians worshipped many gods, but they bowed to none completely. Their pantheon was fluid, blending with every coast they touched. Balat Gebel might become Astarte in Cyprus, or Aphrodite in Greece. Melkart of Tyre might be reborn as Heracles in Hellas. To outsiders, this seemed inconsistent. To them, it was harmony, proof that divinity, like language, could take many forms and still remain one, that openness extended beyond faith. In art, they borrowed and transformed. In trade, they adapted. They had learned Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mesopotamian accounting, Greek design, and wove it all into something uniquely their own. Where others drew borders, the Phoenicians drew routes. Their alphabet was the purest reflection of their spirit, simple, portable, universal. It belonged to no nation, yet it served them all. The letters carried not only sound but philosophy. That meaning was not fixed, that understanding was possible between any two minds willing to meet halfway. Perhaps this is why their legacy endures even when their monuments have crumbled. Empires fall when their walls are breached. Civilizations survive when their ideas are shared. The Phoenicians chose the latter. In a world obsessed with conquest, they mastered conversation. They built cities not as fortresses but as harbors, places of arrival, not exclusion. Every ship that left Byblos carried more than goods. It carried a way of seeing the world, and so their memory lingers, quiet but unbroken. We live today in their inheritance, in a world connected by words, by trade, by the same restless curiosity that once drove them across the sea. To think like a Phoenician is to understand that truth is not a destination but a dialogue. That knowledge grows through movement, that every encounter, even across oceans, is a chance to remember we belong to the same story. There came a moment when the alphabet no longer belonged to Byblos or even to Phoenicia. It had crossed the horizon too many times to have a homeland anymore. From Tyre to Carthage, from Greece to Rome, the same letters appeared in new shapes, carrying new names, yet still pulsing with the same breath. The world, once divided by tongues, began to speak with one rhythm. This was the quiet triumph of the Phoenicians, a victory without armies. Their alphabet had become invisible infrastructure, binding distant minds together. On the docks of Alexandria, scribes copied texts in Greek beside tablets in Phoenician. In the markets of Cyprus, contracts were signed in half a dozen dialects, all cousins of the same written form. Even the scrolls of early Israel and the ledgers of Babylon carried its trace. It is difficult to grasp how radical this was. Before writing became alphabetic, memory belonged to the few, the priest, the scholar, the court, but now it could belong to anyone with a hand and a surface to mark. Humanity had democratized thought itself. The written word was no longer a mirror of power, it was the foundation of it. Every civilization that adopted the alphabet reshaped it. Some added vowels, others softened consonants, a few bent its lines into art, but the essence stayed unchanged. Sound turned to shape, shape turned to thought, thought turned to permanence. The alphabet became the most enduring vessel ever built, one that could cross not only seas, but centuries. The Phoenicians, pragmatic as always, did not guard their invention. They released it like a tide. To them, sharing was strength. They must have understood that the alphabet's survival depended on its ability to adapt, to be reborn in new hands. And so, through the centuries, it moved freely, carried by merchants, teachers, monks, and dreamers, until every coastline bore its mark. If the sea was the body of the ancient world, then writing became its bloodstream. Each port was a heartbeat, each letter a pulse. Words linked kingdoms more surely than roads ever could. The alphabet turned geography into conversation, and within that vast dialogue, something subtle changed in the human mind. Once we learned to capture speech on surfaces, we began to think differently, to see the world not just as it is, but as it could be remembered. Writing gave thought a second life. Ideas could now travel farther than their makers, living on after their voices had faded. Byblos may have been only a small port, a name tucked into the folds of time, but through its invention the world learned to see itself, to read, to imagine, to preserve. The Word had become the world. And in that moment, humanity took its first step toward immortality, not through temples or kings, but through the fragile grace of letters. The sea forgot nothing, and neither did Byblos. Long after the sails of Phoenicia had faded from the horizon, the city endured, quiet and self-contained, like a candle protected by its own flame. Empires came and went around it, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Crusader, Ottoman, each leaving footprints, each certain it had conquered time. But Byblos did not resist. It simply absorbed, softened, and outlasted them all. In the Roman age, it became a provincial port adorned with colonnades and theaters. Latin inscriptions still mark its stones, their letters clean and measured, the descendants of the very alphabet that once sailed from the shore. Centuries later, when the Byzantine Empire rose, new crosses appeared over old temples, and the goddess Balat Gebel, once radiant in gold, took on another name, another face, that of Mary, Mother of Christ. Yet beneath the hymns, the rhythm of the sea remained unchanged. During the Crusades, Byblos, or Gibelais as they called it, became a stronghold on the road between east and west. Knights built towers over Phoenician foundations, unaware that their own languages carried the blood of the city they fortified. Even their banners, embroidered with Latin script, were silent acknowledgments of what Byblos had given the world. When the Ottomans arrived, they found a fishing town, modest but alive, its people still tending the same shore their ancestors had known since the dawn of history. The great power shifted and fell, but Byblos never lost its purpose. It remained what it had always been, a harbor, a bridge, a point of return. And then, in modern times, as archaeologists began to dig beneath its streets, the truth emerged layer by layer. The Bronze Age citadel, the Phoenician walls, the Roman temples, the Crusader keep. Each discovery felt like a heartbeat resurfacing. What had been buried was not forgotten. It had only been sleeping. Today, the ruins of Byblos rise beside cafes and homes. Children play on steps once used by kings. The smell of the sea mingles with coffee and diesel, and the same wind that filled the sails of ancient traders still stirs the laundry on modern balconies. It is a strange harmony, the living and the dead sharing the same sunlight. Visitors often describe the city as peaceful, even hauntingly so, but perhaps what they feel is not peace, it is memory, thick as salt in the air. Every breeze carries whispers of languages once spoken here, sounds that built the foundations of the modern world. Byblos does not need monuments to prove its greatness. Its monument is time itself. Few places have lived so long, and fewer still have done so without forgetting who they are. The city remains what has always been, a quiet witness to the continuity of human thought. And when night falls over the Mediterranean and the waves reflect the first stars, Byblos looks exactly as it did thousands of years ago, listening, waiting, remembering. Some cities are born once and spend eternity growing old. Byblos was born many times and never learned how to die. Every civilization that passed through her left something behind, and in return took a fragment of her soul. She gave Egypt her cedar, Greece her letters, Rome her order, and the modern world its memory. Yet through all of it, she remained herself, a small harbor on a quiet coast, carrying the pulse of humanity in her stones. Perhaps that is why the ancients called her the oldest continuously inhabited city on earth. She did not survive by chance. She survived because she understood the rhythm of renewal. In every destruction she saw an opening, in every ending, a beginning. When temples fell, homes were built upon their foundations. When languages changed, their sounds blended, making new ones. When gods were forgotten, their names lived on as echoes in other prayers. To live in Byblos was to understand that time is not a straight road but a tide, retreating, returning, erasing, and rewriting. Each generation stepped upon the same ground but walked in a different direction, guided by the same heartbeat beneath the soil. Archaeologists say that if you cut through the city like a cross-section, you would see 1,000 years stacked like pages in a book. But Byblos is more than a book. It is the act of writing itself. It is where humanity first learned that memory could be built and rebuilt again. Every alphabet that followed was a kind of rebirth. The same thought returning in a new form, the same flame passed from one age to another. The idea that thought can outlive the thinker, that knowledge can be reborn, that is the essence of Byblos. Even now, when the call to prayer drifts over the harbor at dusk, mingling with church bells and the murmur of the sea, you can feel all her births breathing together, pagan chants, Christian hymns, Arabic poetry, all woven into one fabric of sound. It is not confusion, it is continuity. The city does not separate her paths. She wears them all at once, bronze and marble, faith and doubt, ruin and rebirth. Each new age adds another layer, another tone to her voice, and that voice is calm, never proud, never broken. Because Byblos has seen what every civilization eventually learns, that nothing lasts forever except the desire to begin again. The city of many births stands as proof that endurance is not about resisting change, but embracing it as naturally as the tide returns to the shore that never left. Somewhere in the modern world, there are still a few who can read the letters of Byblos. Not many, a handful of scholars, a few patient archaeologists, the kind of people who spend their lives listening to stones. They study the curves of ancient script, the scratches left by forgotten hands, and in those tiny marks, they hear echoes of a world that once spoke through sound and silence alike. They call themselves linguists or epigraphers, but what they truly are is something older, keepers of breath. Each inscription they decipher is a resurrection, each translation a small act of mercy against the oblivion of time. In quiet rooms lit by desk lamps, they lean over photographs of broken tablets, tracing lines that were carved 3,000 years ago. They whisper the words aloud, not to prove a theory, but to see if the language still fits in a human mouth. Sometimes it does. The vowels feel strange, the consonants harsh, but then for a brief instant the past exhales. These scribes are not rewriting history, they are reawakening it. They are the last link in an unbroken chain, from the first hand that carved a Phoenician aleph into wood to the scholars who now record it in glowing digital code. Between them lies the story of all writing, all memory, all thought that refuses to vanish. It is humbling to realize that every alphabet we use in books, on screens, in whispers, is a descendant of those same signs they study. What they hold in their fingers is not just an artifact, but an ancestor. Some of them visit Byblos, standing in the ruins where their words were first conceived. They walk among the fallen columns and whisper translations to the air as if reporting back to the gods who once listened here. And though the tourists pass by without noticing, the city seems to respond. The sea stirs, the wind changes, and for a moment it feels as if the stones themselves are listening. Perhaps they are. Perhaps they recognize their language being spoken again after centuries of silence. Because what's memory, if not a conversation that never ends? The last scribes know that their work will never be finished. There will always be another tablet to decipher, another fragment to fit, another gap in history to fill. But they continue quietly, without applause, not for fame, but for faith. Faith that the words of Byblos, the first words humanity ever wrote, still matter. For as long as someone reads them, Byblos is alive. In the end, everything returns to the sea. The words, the ships, the stones, the names, all of them carried back by the same tide that once brought them to life. Byblos has always known this. For thousands of years, it has watched civilizations rise and dissolve like foam on the water, beautiful, brief, inevitable. And yet, it never mourned. The city understood that the sea does not take, it remembers. At night, when the harbor is quiet and the wind moves through the ruins, you can almost hear it. The soft conversation between water and stone, the waves brush against the ancient quay, tracing the same patterns they did when cedar ships were moored here. The stars above shimmer on the surface, turning the harbor into a mirror of time. It is hard to tell where the present ends and the past begins. Perhaps they never did. Every alphabet that ever left this coast is still out there drifting, in books, in voices, in the invisible current of thought that connects us all. Each time we write, each time we speak, we return unknowingly to Byblos. The lines on a page, the letters on a screen, even the breath between words, all carry the memory of the first marks carved beside this sea. Byblos has no need for monuments. Its monument is the human voice. Its temple is the act of remembrance. Its prayer is the rhythm of the waves. And maybe that is what the Phoenicians understood from the beginning, that immortality is not a gift of the gods, but of memory. As long as someone remembers, as long as someone speaks, nothing is ever truly lost. The sea will rise and fall. The stones will crumble. Languages will shift and merge and be born again. But somewhere on some distant shore, a child will learn the shapes of letters, the descendants of the same alphabet that first breathed here. And in that moment, the circle closes. The city will live again, not in ruins or relics, but in the motion of a pen, the pulse of a word, the whisper of a story. So let the waves take what they must. Byblos will not disappear. It will return as it always has, beneath new names, new voices, new tides. Thank you for drifting with us through Byblos, the city where humanity first found its voice. This is Lenora, where history sleeps beneath the stars.